Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview of this week's insider review of the best recordings of Arturo Toscanini. I want to do a little talk. I want to talk for a bit about Toscanini's importance as a conductor in the 20th century. He was basically the most important conductor of the 20th century for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that very few people consider that I really think is just a fascinating topic on its own is what he tells us about authentic performance practice. This is one of those topics that's so controversial because, we can't go back and listen to what things sounded like, in like Beethoven's day. But there is an unbroken tradition of performance from Beethoven's day. That performance was that, as I pointed out, of the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. Yes, instruments changed, aesthetic ideals slightly changed, but very slightly. And Toscanini is one of the guys who tells us just how slightly they changed. Because Toscanini was born in 1867. And he died in 1957. And he was active until he was at least 86 or 87, around 1953, 54. So, for heaven's sake, the man was born exactly 40 years after Beethoven died, which is not a heck of a lot. And he was around for the next 90 years conducting and performing. Now, it is true that most of his recordings date from the last third of his life, because recording itself as a technology only dated from the last third of his life. That's understandable. But his taste, his education was all formed in the second half of the 19th century. And that's really, I think, something whose significance hasn't been examined, not by scholars. There have, of course, been articles about Toscanini, lots of them, by Toscanini fans. And there are discussions of historical recordings, which are mostly useless, in my view. But it's quite marvelous to know that we have a living testament to the aesthetics of the age. Now, one of the reasons that Toscanini's importance in this respect has been, I think, undervalued is because we regard him as the founder of the modern school of conducting. In this, he's often contrasted with, for example, Wilhelm Furtwangler, who people regard as sort of the old romantic school or a throwback to the old romantic school of conducting. The truth is, this is all bullshit. Toscanini was 20 years older than Furtwangler. He was an older generation. And he obviously, this is the man who played cello in the premiere of Verdi's Otello. Do you think for 1 minute that his practice differed all that hugely from what Verdi himself did at the premiere of Otello, or Verdi wanted? I don't think he conducted it. But the point is that we mythologize these things. We make great differences between tiny spans of time. The difference between Beethoven's death and Toscanini's death was, 130 years. In geological time, it's nothing. And in aesthetic time, it's very, very little. One of the ways that academics and people who dwell on crazy details, like record collectors, try to exaggerate the importance of trivial differences is by creating a false periodicity. By saying, in this period everyone did this, then in this period everyone did that. One of the best examples of that has been the whole controversy over vibrato in orchestral playing. Vibrato in orchestral playing is just, the early music people say, there wasn't any, and they play without it. It's crazy nonsense. It's crazy nonsense for so many reasons, and I've talked about it endlessly, but it's one of those topics that I like to bring up as an exemplar because it's easy to prove that these people have no clue. You have the Roger Norringtons, said before World War I or World War II, orchestras didn't use vibrato. It's like they all woke up and said, oh, gee, it's 1945, January 1st. Now it's time to put the vibrato back in the orchestra. It's all foolishness. Absolute foolishness. And Toscanini is one of the guys who tells us that. The guy who played the cello in the premiere of Verdi's Otello, which was around, 1880 something? He was there. And he knows what everybody was doing. And he made his orchestras do what he thought sounded best. And what did he think sounded best? Well, turns out we know, because critics noticed. And he told us, Toscanini himself. I wrote about it in an article that was published in the scholarly journal Music and Letters in 2012. The article was called So Klingt Wien, Conductors, Orchestras, and Vibrato in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the title itself comes from Bruno Walter, who said that he first heard the Vienna Philharmonic in 1897, and now here he is in 1961, and the string sound is exactly the same as what he heard in 1897, even down to the vibrato. That's what Bruno Walter said. He said that was the sound of Vienna, so klingt Wien. But I also adduce more evidence from other conductors, including Toscanini, who was the oldest of all of the ones who lived up to about the long play era, to make recordings in good enough sound that we can tell what he was doing, not just by listening, because you can't really hear vibrato in the orchestra. You can hear its complete absence by the fact that the strings sound like garbage. But how much and what kind is very, very difficult to tell. You can tell strings sound beautiful en masse as a group. You can tell they sound less beautiful. But how they're getting there and how much vibrato, the frequency, the type is very, very difficult when you've got a lot of people playing together. They all just blend together. It's very obvious. But what do we know about Toscanini and his handling of vibrato, which he learned, at the Parma Conservatory or wherever he was in the 1870s, for heaven's sake, Well, it happens to be, we know. In 1946, the British critic Julian Herbage noted, quote, one of the secrets of Toscanini is that he insists on pianissimos always being warm, that is, played with vibrato, unquote. So there's one thing he did. And then we have a quotation from Toscanini himself, from Samuel Chotsinoff, who was the manager of the NBC Symphony Orchestra between 1939 and 1945. And Toscanini said, he was complaining about critics. Toscanini said, don't speak to me about critics. They know nothing. They think because the violins vibrate all the time, yes, they make a beautiful tone. No, a fast vibrato make a beautiful tone, not a slow one. Our NBC violins make quick vibrato. That make beautiful tone! Exclamation point. End quote. There you go. We know what Toscanini was doing, and he's been doing it since whenever, time immemorial. Not only did orchestras have their own ideas about appropriate vibrato, but so did conductors, and they imposed it on their orchestras. And they've been doing it forever. One of the things that Toscanini had in common with Furtwangler was the insistence on vibrato. That's in here too. We have reviews. We have reviews of Furtwangler showing up in London in, let's see, when was this? 1931. Yes, with the Vienna Philharmonic. In 1931, he was in London. And one of the critics noted, to begin with, our method of blowing the woodwinds is unsatisfactory. We have adopted the French and Italian system with vibrato. It's extremely difficult properly to control the reed when playing with even the slightest of vibratos. It is this circumstance that impairs the purity of tone and intonation in the higher registers. Well, they were doing it. The vibrato of which I speak is, I believe, an absurd endeavor, perhaps unconsciously, on the part of the performer to imitate the vibrato of the string players and of the human voice. In the case of the former, the vibrato of the left hand is nowadays regarded as a fundamental necessity and is used at all times except on the open strings. There you go. That's a review of Furtwangler and the Vienna Philharmonic, treated in comparison to the less than lovely tone of English orchestras at the time. the evidence is all out there. And Toscanini is one of the best sources of that evidence. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, the whole comparison between Toscanini and Furtwangler anyway is ridiculous. They're set up as aesthetic opposites. They weren't. They weren't. They were two sides of the same coin, perhaps. But I really don't even think the comparison is fair because, as I said, Toscanini belonged to another generation, an older generation, and he was, in fact, a vastly more important and enormously more gifted conductor than Furtwangler was, both in his range of repertoire and I think in the results he was able to obtain. And that was one of the reasons that Furtwangler was so jealous of him, especially when Toscanini was chosen to conduct at Bayreuth as the favorite of the Bayreuth set. Why? Because he was the greatest conductor alive. And what do you think? You think they weren't playing with vibrato? Come on, folks. Anyway, I just wanted to give this little introduction to the talk that you can see as a Classics Today Insider subscriber on Toscanini's best recordings that embody the characteristics just noted. So I urge you all to please subscribe to classicstoday.com, become an insider, and enjoy this series of videos, conductor videos initially, but we'll also do other soloists. And these will all be videos with sound clips that you can sample and no ads in addition. And I really do hope that you enjoy the chat. It'll be Monday morning's chat. Every Monday morning, more or less, is how we're doing this. So keep on listening, folks. I'll see you as an insider at classicstoday.com. Take care.